Hi, this is Anthony and welcome back to my show. Today's title is DB Cooper, Using Logic to Unmask the Hijacker, but really a better title would be Using Logic to Understand the Hijacking. Unfortunately, I'm limited to the number of characters that I could put into a title on YouTube, and sometimes you have to make titles as exciting as possible. So today's the 51st anniversary of the infamous skyjacking, when a man who bought a ticket using the name Dan Cooper, but due to a reporter's error has since become universally known as DB Cooper, hijacked Northwest Orient Flight 305 from Portland bound to Seattle and claimed to have a bomb in his attaché case. Eventually, the plane landed in Seattle, passengers and some of the crew were able to leave, and the skyjacker was given $200,000 and 4 parachutes. The plane took off, and at approximately 8:13 p.m., Cooper jumped from the plane via the aft stairs, which are in the back of the plane. Now, I'm a law and order type of person, and I don't want people hijacking planes for ransom. But I think sometimes when you have pirates on the open seas, or bandits in the Wild West, or prisoners trying to escape from Alcatraz on rafts made from inflated raincoats, sometimes you have to secretly hope that they get away with their daring exploits. I think many people, including myself, would like to think, since he went through all the trouble, that he did make it out safely and successfully. And in the over 50 years since the Cooper skyjacking, many researchers have identified various people whom they consider to be good suspects based on what profile of the hijacker is thought to be. And I'm going to go over some of those, discussing which ones I think are accurate and which ones I think are misinterpretations or don't follow from solid logical thinking. Now, I want to point out I'm not a trained psychologist or psychiatrist. I'm not a criminal profiler. My degrees, including a graduate degree, are in political science, but I do spend a lot of time looking at how political leaders, both in the United States and other countries, think and how that causes them to act, especially on the world stage. And so I think that over many decades of this, I do have some insight into both how people think and behave. Let me give you an example. On a couple occasions I lived in Russia, and I saw things and behaviors that seemed to be extremely illogical or not well thought out. I saw the design of certain things such as coat hangers that seemed to be terribly designed compared to coat hangers that you'd find in other countries. But then I realized that the difference in design is because where I lived in the center of Siberia, during a good part of the year, people wore extremely heavy winter coats that an American coat hanger would not be able to support. So while you wouldn't use a Russian coat hanger for an American coat if you could help it, you almost have to have one if you were hanging up a Russian coat. So if you understand the fuller context of something, there usually is a logic to it in the long run. Okay, so how can we look at the logic and illogic of the Cooper skyjacking? Let's look at some of the relevant profiles done of Cooper. He was a white male, although described as having darker skin, but never as any ethnicity other than Caucasian. Approximately 45 years of age. It's likely that he had some military experience and probably had some experience with parachutes or skydiving, but not necessarily as much as one would expect. Now let's think about what he's wearing. A business suit and pants, white shirt, and a black clip-on tie. And he was wearing loafers, according to one website I saw. And of course, loafers are slip-on dress shoes that you can wear with a suit, but they do not have shoelaces. They are slip-ons. Now let's think about the weather at the time of the year. I checked the historic weather reports from Portland International Airport, and they confirm what was reported at the time and since then, that there was rain in the area. Most of what I've seen as far as the air temperature, that it was -7 degrees Fahrenheit at 10,000 feet, and the wind chill factor is estimated at between -35 and -70 degrees Fahrenheit. Some of the area that the plane had flown over already had snow on it, and at that time would get much more snow over the next couple days. The area that Cooper might have jumped over would experience quite a bit of rain over the next few days after the incident. I live in Oregon, not far from the general region where Cooper was thought to have jumped over in southwestern Washington. I can tell you, even going outside at night to take out the garbage, it's extremely cold here. And quite often, if we don't have rain by 7 p.m. this time of the year, we'll have a thin layer of ice on our car windshields. Now let's think about motive. Cooper admitted to a stewardess that he had a grudge, but not a grudge against her airline. Now, he could have been lying, but I doubt it. So I would say that this rules out suspects who worked for that airline. I don't believe that this was a so-called inside job. On the face of it, one would think that this was a caper to get $200,000 quickly. But what if it wasn't? And I'm not suggesting some outlandish CIA conspiracy, which I know that some people may be pushing. But what was the real purpose of the hijacking? And does it fit in with the motives that is often given for many of the well-known D.B. Cooper suspects that researchers have identified over the years? Now, some suspects were career criminals who often had some military background. For a career criminal, hijacking a plane would make sense. And it wasn't the first time that it happened, although it seems that most hijacked planes were hijacked to take people to other countries or for political reasons rather than for ransom. Might somebody hijack a plane for the purpose of a ransom? Yes, it was done occasionally according to the Wikipedia article on skyjacking. But some of the candidates to be Cooper didn't have criminal background, and it's only suggested that they may have temporarily lost their job at the time, and that's what caused them to commit the skyjacking. So let's use some logic on that. You're somebody that works for a railroad like William Smith, or you work in a lab that deals with exotic aerospace metals like Vince Peterson. Let's say that you did get laid off temporarily. Now, most people would just apply for unemployment insurance. What would you do? Would you apply for unemployment, or would you decide to commit a risky illegal act on an airliner? If for some reason you decided instead of applying for unemployment insurance, you were going to commit a crime, wouldn't it be easier to rob a bank or a liquor store, or to break into one of those after hours and get the money, than it is to travel 4 time zones across the country to commit air piracy when there's nothing in your history to indicate any type of criminal record? Okay, let's assume that you're one of the candidates like Ted Braden, who had military experience, and you were going to commit the crime. Many researchers think that somebody like Braden is a good candidate because they have a military background and they have survival training. Okay, now you don't need to have much knowledge of paratroopers, but usually we've seen documentaries or movies where they jump out of planes in World War II or maybe over Korea or Vietnam. What are they wearing on their feet? Boots. They're wearing uniforms. Often they're wearing a helmet. Sometimes they might be wearing goggles. What was Cooper wearing? His black business suit with loafers and a black raincoat. Now, I'm not sure exactly what type of raincoat he was wearing, but I have one from around that time period, and they're not necessarily all that warm, even with the lining that you can zip in. Did Cooper have goggles? None that were seen by the stewardess. It's possible that he could have had some in the pocket of his raincoat. He opened up his attaché case and showed a bomb. There didn't seem to be any goggles visible. Again, the weather he was jumping out into while the plane was going 200 miles an hour was somewhere between -7 and -70 degrees Fahrenheit, in wind and rain over an area that was extremely rugged and forested, and part of which had snow that had already fallen, and the rest of it would have been muddy and slippery. I don't know if you've ever worn loafers, but it's extremely easy when you're walking in them to accidentally step out of them under normal circumstances. But jumping out of a plane at that altitude and weather without goggles, wearing loafers that would likely be sucked off as you fell through the air, and even if you made it to the ground safely, walking through that terrain in loafers to safety would be extremely difficult. It does not make any sense that somebody who had paratrooping experience would be dressed up like a businessman and jump out under those conditions over that area. And if you were going to do that, and you thought that you could survive, which I doubt that you could, but if you could and you did, you probably would need an accomplice. But to have an accomplice, you need to actually be able to rendezvous with them. Now, Cooper told the crew that he wanted to be flown to Mexico City, and he was told that first they would have to stop in Reno for refueling. He said that was fine. However, the flight path directly to Mexico City and the flight path to Reno are slightly different. And since there's no way for him to communicate with any accomplice from the plane, as there were no cell phones, if an accomplice was going to be on the ground under the route of the plane going to Mexico City, he or she would not be able to rendezvous with Cooper, who then had to jump out of the plane which was headed towards Reno. And it's believed that Cooper was delayed quite a bit in jumping, so was much farther south than where he had intended to jump. Therefore, his accomplice would have been much farther north waiting for Cooper. Also, even though Cooper asked for unmarked bills, which they were unmarked, they were bills that had been photographed and had their serial numbers recorded. Most likely anybody requesting a large amount of money like that would know that it would be extremely difficult to spend any of it should they survive, because people would be on the lookout for certain $20 bills bearing certain serial numbers. And just in case you didn't know, 8 years after the hijacking, $5,800 of the ransom money was found buried in the sand on the Washington side of the Columbia River downstream from Vancouver. It's believed that Cooper parachuted upstream from Vancouver, so quite a distance away, and it doesn't make any sense for Cooper, if he had survived, to have gone that distance, likely on foot, to bury a little bit of money just to throw off searchers. In the off chance that somebody, perhaps 8 years later, somebody might find some of that money. It might be logical under certain circumstances for a criminal to try to misdirect searchers by leaving some money or other evidence someplace, but this was money that was buried in the sand somehow and found by a young boy digging a hole 8 years later. It is not logical that money was intentionally buried there to throw off searchers, as some people believe. So what do I think is a plausible explanation for hijacking a plane under these conditions? Because almost everything that happened seemed to be pretty illogical or poorly thought out. And sometimes people do not clearly think out their strategy in executing something. That may be the case here, but I don't think that a man who acted very calmly during this whole situation, who went to the effort of constructing either a real or a fake bomb, would then make so many blunders when it came to the execution of the rest of the hijacking if he intended it to be successful. There are certainly circumstances where planes have been hijacked for ransom, and about half a year later, Richard Floyd McCoy pulled off a similar hijacking, and some people speculated that he might have been Cooper, although there are some reasons to discount that theory. But McCoy's jump was farther south under better weather conditions during the day, and while Cooper was described by the stewardess who sat next to him during the ordeal as being very calm and smoking 8 cigarettes, McCoy was described as being extremely nervous and was a Mormon who did not smoke. I've heard researchers suggest that Cooper really was not a smoker but smoked cigarettes during the skyjacking to throw off searchers who would be searching for a chain smoker. I think that it's actually the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard. I've never smoked, but just thinking about smoking 8 cigarettes makes me almost want to throw up. If Cooper was somebody with steely nerves who could remain calm during a skyjacking, trying to smoke 8 cigarettes when you're not a smoker would make you cough and gag and probably throw up. If you don't believe me and you're not a smoker, go buy a pack of cigarettes at a convenience store and smoke 8 of them in a row. I think that someone dressed in a business suit without much in regards to skydiving apparel, who was hijacking a plane in absolutely terrible weather, in pitch black darkness, with no moon, jumping from a plane at 10,000 feet, where there was cloud cover at 5,000 feet, so having very little idea at all where he was jumping, much less where he would be when he landed, I'm not at all convinced that Cooper was intending to survive. While he was on the plane, Cooper was described as being very calm. He smoked at least 8 cigarettes and had a couple drinks. If you're watching this video, you're probably not the type of person who would hijack a plane. You're not a criminal. But let's say you were a criminal, and that you're going to hijack a plane, hopefully get the ransom and parachutes delivered to you without incident, that is, not having law enforcement storm the plane and apprehend you, and then have the plane take off again, and you jump out into freezing pitch black weather whereby you were intending to land wearing a business suit and somehow walk out of the rugged forested Cascade Mountains of the Pacific Northwest. Well, wouldn't you be a little nervous? How about this scenario? You're a veteran. You join the military in your late teens or early 20s and perhaps put 20 years in. You're in your mid-30s and you're retired from the service and you don't feel like you fit into American society anymore. Perhaps at the end of your career you saw some service in Vietnam and you saw that it was not going the way it was portrayed in the media. Perhaps you resent the way that Vietnam vets are being treated by the American public. Let's say if you were ever married, your marriage has fallen apart and you're divorced now. Your parents have passed away. Maybe you've been diagnosed with cancer, perhaps pancreatic cancer. Some cancer these days are still really tough to effectively treat, but you have to remember this was 51 years ago. Maybe you've been given 6 months to live. You don't see yourself as having anything to live for. Having been a paratrooper, you're a bit of a thrill seeker and you want to end the last chapter of your life in kind of a spectacular fashion. Might you then do what Cooper seems to have done? And if he was intending to do what I suggest, then he probably was at peace with how he was going to conduct his final journey. That would explain his calmness. You don't need to be worried about making the jump and surviving the landing if you're not really concerned about surviving the landing. Quite frankly, whatever the motivation was for the skyjacking, whether it was because Cooper thought he could get away with the money without thinking things through, or whether he knew that he would not be able to survive, I think it's unlikely that the individual did make it to the ground and then back home with or without the money. I think if one looks at the actual circumstances of the flight that night, that Cooper either made a number of fatal blunders or intended to do a specific thing which would not be impacted and perhaps be assisted by things such as sub-freezing air and the rugged terrain. I think that my explanation is a very logical one, that I'm certainly willing to agree that I could be wrong and that Cooper probably just did not think things clearly through. I would love to hear from you. My videos on D.B. Cooper are some of my most successful ones, and I really appreciate everybody's comments. If you have theories of your own or have other candidates that you think better match what's been suggested as far as identities, I would love to hear from you on that. And check out my other videos. I have over 150 on various topics, including possible buried Spanish treasure in the Pacific Northwest. Please click that like and subscribe button. Happy Thanksgiving and happy D.B. Cooper days.